feel free to bring it up at the end. 3 points that I want to make and want you to take away. One, Alaska is facing a budget challenge, but the question to me, and the question that I think that a lot of us need to ask ourselves, is how big is it? Because some people are claiming it's very big and requires diversion of the PFD and taxes in order to fill. I don't think it's quite that big, and I'll talk about why. 2, there is a solid, in my opinion, there is a solid and realistic fiscal alternative that doesn't rely on PFD cuts or taxes in order to resolve our fiscal situation on a long-term basis. I don't think we need to go down the road that some others are suggesting we need to go down in terms of PFD cuts, and I'll explain what I think that proposal or what that alternative is. And third, I think the 3 bills that are out there, what are sometimes referred to as the big 3 bills right now, on fiscal plans, Senate Bill 128, which is the governor's, Senate Bill 114, which is Senator McGuire's, and House Bill 224, Representative Hawker's, which was presented to House Finance yesterday. I think they're unnecessary. All of them take the PFD. All of them raid the PFD. The governor's added taxes on top of that. But I think all 3 are unnecessary. They're imbalanced between what they're doing to the private and the government sectors, and they may do more harm to the Alaska economy than good. So my first point, Alaska is facing a budget challenge, but how big is it? These are the numbers that the people in Juneau are seeing, and when they talk about the size of the budget deficit, these are the numbers that they're referring to. The top line is about $5.2 billion, which is the spending, the current spending for fiscal year 2016. And when I say fiscal year, they run from July 1, fiscal year 2016 runs from July 1, 2015 to June 30, 2016. The name of the year is the year in which it ends. So these are fiscal year 2016 is the spending level that is currently in the budget, and that's the spending level that people look at. Over the last 3 years, the revenue forecasts that the state has been making have been steadily dropping. The red line is the forecast that was made in the fall of 2013, and it showed a dip in revenues and then coming back up to about the 5.2 level and then trailing off again. These revenue forecasts are made by the Department of Revenue. They're primarily based upon a forecast of oil price and a forecast of oil production. I'll talk a little bit about what I think of both of those in a moment, but that's primarily the big drivers on these revenue forecasts. Fall 2014, a year ago now, is the blue line, and it showed, as a result of what was going on in the oil world, a dip in oil revenues to the state to about $2 billion plus or minus 2.5 billion mark, and then coming back up again. Both of those showed recoveries. Both of those forecasts showed recoveries in about the 2017, 2018 time frame. And the expectation was during this time period, when they set the budgets based upon those 2 revenue forecasts, the expectation was they'd use the CBR, the Constitutional Budget Reserve, which I can explain in detail if anybody has any questions, and fill that gap until revenues recovered. The thing that has changed the demeanor and the conversation down in Juneau a lot is the forecast that came out this last fall, that come out in December, in October. The fall revenue bill comes out in October, and that forecast, December. It's set in October and then comes out in December. That revenue forecast is the line at the bottom, the one with the boxes in it. And that shows the same sort of dip that the fall 2014 forecast showed, but then shows that flattening out and staying at roughly $2 billion on out. That's what's driving the conversation in Juneau. That view that we've hit a revenue slump, and that revenue slump is going to be persistent on out into the future. So when they look at this forecast, they say to themselves, we're not going to be able to fill it through the CBR. It's a persistent one, and now that's what's led to the conversation about converting permanent fund dividend monies over to the general fund. My view is we're overstating the problem. This analysis is based on a model that Dr. Scott Goldsmith of the University of Alaska Anchorage Institute of Social and Economic Research, in my opinion, the best economist in the state for looking at this sort of thing. He's been at it 30 years. He's refined this model over time. It takes into account a number of factors. I think that what the state's looking at in terms of revenue is wrong, and we're overstating the depth of the problem, and as a consequence, we're rushing too much toward using permanent fund dividends and income taxes to fill a problem that I don't think exists over the long term. If you recalculate the state's revenue forecast using $80 a barrel, and that's $80 a barrel by 2020, and I'll talk about the basis for that for all of these in just a second. You recalculate the revenue forecast using reaching $80 a barrel by 2020. If you recalculate it using a 3% production decline curve as opposed to a 5% production decline curve, which is what the state has been using, you put in a little bit of new oil, you put in Alaska LNG, and you use the permanent fund earnings reserve, the portion remaining after taking out the dividend and after taking out inflation proofing, and you use that to help supplement revenues, which is what the sustainable budget model has always done. And you assume, and this is actually a fairly important factor, you assume population growth is going forward is going to be 0.5%, and the Department of Revenue has assumed a full percent going forward. If you assume population growth is going to be 0.5%, then the long-term sustainable revenue number that we're looking at over time is $4.3 billion. Now, we're not going to have $4.3 billion tomorrow, but what this forecast does is look out into the future and look at the oil markets and say, oil markets go through dips, right? They go through low cycles and they go through high cycles. Let's look through all those cycles and let's develop a smooth curve that cuts through those cycles, assumes that we're going to spend savings to supplement revenues during the low dips, assumes that we're going to save above the sustainable revenue level when revenues are above that spending line, and smooths it out and tries to get a long-term, steady, reliable prediction of revenue. And if you make those assumptions, the revenue number is $4.3 billion. That's compared with what they're looking at Juneau right now as being $2 billion, extending on out infinitum into the future. If you say that the revenue is going to be $4.3 billion on a long-term basis, the problem that we're looking at is much different than the problem that people in Juneau are looking at right now, thinking that the revenue is going to be $2 billion over the long term. Now, I often get questions, every time I get questions actually, about what's the basis for these numbers, right? Okay, they're great, they're cute numbers, they get you to $4.3 billion, but what's your basis? Look, my day job is dealing with oil and dealing with natural gas, dealing with production issues, dealing with price forecasts, dealing with things that investors look at when they look at Alaska. So I've spent a lot of time dealing with numbers. You can get all sorts of numbers, right? You can get all sorts of predictions about oil prices. And the state has used predictions about oil prices in their revenue forecast. But over time, I've developed a sense of what are really good models and what are sort of not so good models. And one of the best models out there is the International Energy Agency model. International Energy Agency is, as it says, an international group. They got one of the most sophisticated computer models that I've seen or studied in terms of how they look at where the oil price forecast is going. And in their November 2015 forecast, and this is just 4 months ago, their November 2015 forecast, they said the process of adjustment in the oil market is rarely a smooth one, but in our central scenario, they've got a high case and a low case, but in our central scenario, the market rebalances at $80 a barrel in 2020 with further increases in price thereafter. That's what I've used. I've not used the models that the state has used, which frankly are sort of get everybody in a room in October and guess at what you think the oil prices are going to be going forward. I've used an internationally accepted, an internationally reliable, a good solid model in my opinion to look at what the prices are going to be. Second, production. The state model assumes a 5% production decline over time. And they're doing that based upon what they see has been invested in the North Slope today, projects they see sanctioned, that is, people have committed money to do it, and how those projects are going to play out. They're not looking at prospects, additional volumes that may be out there that people have explored for and found, and are in the process of trying to get together the necessary things to develop. When you do a long-term budget, though, you need to include those things, if they're realistic. Or else you're telling yourself you're going to go into a production decline, a revenue decline, much more precipitous than what you're actually going to experience. And it leads you to things like talking about diverting the PFD and taxes when you don't take these things into account. So my production decline is a production decline of 3%. Frankly, that's what the producers talked about during the SB 21 debate. That's what they said they thought they could achieve if we had the reforms. They have developed in a way that is exhibiting that. A lot of people don't know this, but we're actually producing more this year than we produced last year. More oil in the state this year than we produced last year. We've had increased investment. We have new projects coming on. We are improving. So I've used a figure of 3%, and to back that up, there was just a news article in the Alaska Dispatch News earlier this week that says Repsol and Armstrong have said a project that they're developing could yield up to 120,000 barrels daily. That's over 20% of the current production on the North Slope. We're currently producing about 550 plus or minus. 120 is over 20% of that. That estimated rate is not unreasonable based on the details that have been published about the project, said Mark Myers. So I think the 3% decline rate is the right number to use. In LNG, I know there's a lot of controversy about LNG. I know some people think we ought not to do it. But at a time of historic capital constraint among the oil companies, they have cut back on projects that people said they would never cut back on. The three private companies in this project, BP, Exxon, and ConocoPhillips, are continuing to fund this project. They believe that strongly in this project. They're continuing to fund their participation in this project. So I think LNG has a reasonable basis also. So here's my concern, that we're formulating fiscal policy. We have people down in Juneau formulating fiscal policy, or talking about fiscal policy, and we're checking out from the bottom of a commodity cycle. We're at $30 a barrel, we're below $30 a barrel. We're at the bottom of a commodity cycle. And they're essentially saying that's going to continue forever. That's going to be our revenue source forever. And then they're saying, and then we've got this huge deficit between anything reasonable we want to spend and that $2 billion, so we need to have PFD and we need to have taxes. I think that's the wrong way to do it. And I think as a result of that, we're assuming that we need to cut more spending or raise more new revenue than necessary when we look at it from a long-term perspective. In short, I think we're doing the reverse of the problem we had from 2011 to 2014. Then the legislature and the governor spent thinking that oil was always going to be $100, going to $150, going to $175, and they could spend, right? And they kept having these massive budgets. We overspent the sustainable spending line, the sustainable revenue line, by $7 billion between 2011 and 2014. That's how much more we appropriated and spent than we should have, looking at the long-term revenue sources. But they said it was going to go to $150, ultimately go up to $200. That's what they were predicating on. Now, so they ran to the wrong side. They ran to the wrong side of the boat, right? They spent too much. Now, in my opinion, they're running to the other side of the boat. They're going to capsize us from the other side, saying that, oh my gosh, the sky's falling. We're not going to have these revenues. We're not going to have production. We've got to go to PFD cuts, diversion of PFD to the general revenue, and taxes in order to fill this hole. In my opinion, Alaska is a commodity-based economy. It always has been and always will be. And as a result, we need to take a long-term budget view. We need to look at the commodity cycles, cut through those commodity cycles, determine a revenue line based upon those commodity cycles, and stick to that as opposed to running from one side of the ship to the other every 3 years when the commodity cycle changes. We need to take a long-term budget view, not a one-year snapshot. So that's my first point. How big is the hole? I don't think it's that big. Yes, sir. Quick.
Is that based on the current size or the current spending of government? This analysis.
I'll get to spending in a second. No, the 4.3 is based upon us getting spending down to 4.3, down to the long-term sustainable level. All right, second, I think there's a long-term and solid and realistic fiscal alternative that doesn't rely on PFD cuts and taxes to deal with the situation that we're in. And in my opinion, it's an approach that looks at the full commodity cycle, looks at the highs and the lows that we can expect in revenues going forward, and develops a balanced, sustainable approach that smooths through the revenues, highs and lows. It gets us off the cycle of spending everything we have in our pockets when we have high revenues and going, oh, woe is me, it's always going to be this way when we have low oil prices and low production. We need to smooth through those cycles and take a long-term view. And that's one core principle of what I think the right model needs to be. And the second is, we shouldn't cut the PFD or impose taxes on our private economy because of the impact on the private economy, draining of those funds out of the private economy, rushing them over to the government economy and supporting the government economy, only if it's not avoidable and only to the extent it doesn't harm the overall Alaska economy. In other words, we need to think about not just how much money do we need to take out of the private economy to go support government spending. We need to think about the impact on the private economy as well as we take those dollars out. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the approach, I think the best approach that I've seen, and again, I've studied this for a long time, is to set the spending at long-term sustainable levels based on the best reasonable long-term forecast of oil prices, oil production, and what we've got out there in terms of additional opportunities that are reasonable to believe that they're going to come in the future. Use the permanent fund earnings reserve, and that's the portion remaining after the dividend and after inflation proofing. Use the earnings reserve to act as a balancing mechanism. That is when we're below, when actual revenues are below, cash revenues are below the long-term sustainable level, pull out of the earnings reserve in order to support spending at the long-term sustainable level. And then when we flip back up and we're above, we get revenues above the long-term sustainable level, when we're going through one of the high cycles, take that excess revenue and put it back into the earnings reserve to save it for the next cycle. Because one thing is certain about oil, I've been in it longer than I want to admit. One thing is certain about oil, it goes down, it goes up, and it goes down, and it goes up. And we're always going to have another cycle. Thinking that the cycle you're in at the moment is going to last forever is just the wrong thing to do. So using the permanent fund earnings reserve is that sort of balance. And then we need to remain alert to changes in key long-term forecast variables and adjust those levels, adjust the sustainable levels if there are significant long-term changes. If the LNG project doesn't go, if everybody terminates their participation in the LNG project and it's not going to go, we need to take it out of the forecast. But as long as three of the most sophisticated oil and gas companies in the world, three of the most sophisticated investors in the world, at a time of huge capital constraint, are continuing to invest in this project, we shouldn't write it off and say, oh, well, we just can't count on those revenues. Because what does that lead you to? That leads people to think, okay, well, we need to cut the PFD then to supplement, to replace those revenues, or we need to have taxes to replace those revenues. You need to look realistically at what's out there, and I think LNG is realistic. So, if the revenue side, if the assumptions are $80 a barrel, which I think is reasonable, 3% production decline, new oil, LNG, and the use of the permanent fund earnings reserve, and population growth at 0.5% as opposed to 1%, the long-term sustainable revenue number, the number that cuts through the ups and the downs of the revenue stream is $4.3 billion. Now, we're spending well, let me do this. So, I always get these questions, but what if? What if it's not? What if LNG doesn't go? Or what if oil goes down to $60? Or what if oil declines at 4%? Well, you can use the model to run all that, right? So if it's 75%, if you want to say it's a 75% chance of success that Alaska LNG goes, the long-term sustainable number isn't 4.3, it's 4.1. If you think it's only a 50-50 proposition, the long-term sustainable number isn't 4.3, it's 3.9. And so on. If you think LNG is not going to go, the long-term sustainable number is 3.5. And let me tell you, I've been around Juneau enough, at 3.5, people are going to go to PFD cuts. If they think the long-term revenue number is going to be 3.5, they're going to go to PFD cuts. So if you want to write off LNG, that's fine, but recognize what you're doing is you're moving us a couple of steps closer to PFD cuts. Oil price is going to be 70, oil price is going to be 60, and then combinations. What if Alaska LNG is 75, oil 70, declines 4? I mean, you can go through all of this. And my favorite is this one. What if the Repsol project is right? What if that 120,000 barrels a day is right? Well, then the sustainable number goes up because I don't have 120,000 barrels factored in there. I have some portion of it. The point is you use the best available information you have at the time. You don't go speculating about, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if the other thing happens? You use the best available information you have at the time. And again, that's why I go back to the International Energy Agency, because I think they have the best oil price. That's why I look at what's going on in the slope, because I think that's the best predictor of production. And that's why I look at the investments being made by the other partners in Alaska LNG. private partners, partners who are cutting their capital spending to the bone, but yet they're spending here. I think that's a go project. We were below current spending levels by quite a bit for an 11-year period. You can't tell me that we can't go back and do that. You can't tell me that we can't go back and find where the spending bubble got spent, take that out of the budget and go back to what we did for an 11-year period. So, is it doable? I think it's doable. Steve will talk more about it. There's a bill out there that's not one of the big three. If you talk to your legislators, I would encourage you for them to co-sign this bill or to sponsor it in the Senate. It's HB 311. It is a bill that incorporates the ICER approach, the sustainable budget approach. It could be reworked to be used as a statutory spending cap, or it could be used as a substitute for a part of the Constitution that says appropriation limit. We actually have a provision in the Constitution that is intended to be a spending cap, constitutional spending cap. It's outdated, it never worked well, it's never been implemented because it just provides numbers that are way too high. But you can take this bill and you can turn it into a constitutional limitation on spending to prevent us from getting back into this problem again. Okay, the third point, the big three bills out there, SB 128, the governor's, SB 114, Senator McGuire's, HB 224, Representative Hawker's, in my view, are unnecessary and balanced and may do more harm than good. Why are they unnecessary? Well, if the long-term sustainable revenue level is $4.3 billion and we can cut down to that, we don't need to be going out and grabbing permanent fund dividends and converting it into government. We don't need to be taxing in order to have a sustainable economy. We do need to spend from savings. We do need to spend from the earnings reserve after dividends and after inflation proofing, but we don't need to be adding additional revenues. And in my opinion, until we have a much better feel for where long-term oil and gas markets are headed, there's no compelling case, there's no reason to have PFD cuts and taxes. Second, SB 128 and 114, I'll talk about Hawker's in just a second, are hugely imbalanced. This is a calculation of what the percent of spending cuts are, government spending cuts, compared to what the percent cuts are in the PFD. You'll see that the spending cuts under both the GCI proposal, I'm sure most of you have heard of the GCI proposals, spending cuts under the GCI proposal and under the governor's bill, with the exception of 1 year, which is sort of an aberration, stay under 20%. The PFD cuts, both of them are proposing, start above 50%, go out to above 60%, and by 2025, the governor's is above, well, actually is near 80% in terms of PFD cuts. When you add in the additional taxes that the governor's proposed, the governor is essentially proposing to suck out of the private economy through PFD cuts and through taxes more than 100% of the PFD. So basically he's saying all that money you've been giving, that the state has given to its private citizens, injected into the private economy through the permanent fund dividend, we're going to take all that back plus some by 2025. So there's an imbalance. I mean, this is what they're doing with the government economy. This is what they're doing to the money that's in the private economy now that's going on. The percentages don't even come close to being the same. This is Representative Hawker's bill. I got to admit, the guy has a lot of nerve. He went before the House yesterday and testified on his proposal on what he wanted to do for the PFD. At the end of the day, after you go through all the machinations of his bill, this is his chart, by the way, not mine. When you go through all the machinations of his bill, the PFD numbers he leaves, by 2025, fiscal year 2025, $91. Permanent Fund Corporation currently estimates it as being at around $2,500. So Hawker takes $2,409, converts that into government spending, and leaves $91. That's actually a high point because it's $68 in 2025, $69, $78, $149. It starts at $1,000. We're supposed to have over $2,000 this coming year. It starts at $1,000. Hawker's justification, again, this is a guy who's not running for re-election, obviously. Hawker's justification, he gave an interview to a radio station about why he was proposing this. He said, quote, "The direct indiscriminate redistribution of the permanent fund money, permanent fund earnings, from the resource to the people is pure socialism. It's confiscating wealth and redistributing it without any public purpose, And that's just simply wrong. So if the permanent fund earnings don't belong to the people, then who do they belong to? The government. And that's what Hawker's saying. I don't know how he says distributing it to the people is socialistic, and his proposal to keep it in the government socialist is not socialistic. But that's Hawker's justification. That bill, to me, is a non-starter. So we also need, as I said at the outset, we need to consider the effect of what we're doing to the overall economy. In some previous ICER work, Scott Goldsmith said PFD cuts could do more harm than good. Looking back on the history of the permanent fund from about 2010, he said if the dividend instead had been diverted to state government, if the dividend that we received had instead been diverted to state government, the result would have been capital spending, and capital spending would have generated less employment in Alaska and increased income inequality. Why is that? Because when it comes into the hands of Alaskans, the money is spent mostly in Alaska. If it goes to the government spending capital spending, frankly, most of it's spent outside of Alaska in buying capital goods, and buying iron, and buying concrete, and buying bricks, and buying goods that are then shipped up here. So if you keep the PFD in the hands of the people, more money stays in Alaska than if you give it to the government and it goes out in capital spending. We need to keep in mind. The second, and this is, some people are going to want to talk about this, I'm sure, but if new revenues are required, taxes actually do less harm to the economy than cutting the PFD. Reducing dividends to produce the same amount of revenues as with the proposed income tax would actually cost Alaska more jobs. Okay, on my 3-second overrun. It would cost more jobs and income than would reimposing an income tax. So we need to, when we go through this fiscal policy, we need to keep in mind what we're doing to the overall Alaska economy. Don't just rush to put money over the government. Think about what you're doing to the Alaska economy. What are you doing? So the proposals are imbalanced. We don't need to do it. While the proposals help the government economy, it comes at the expense of Alaska's private economy. We're already having layoffs in Alaska's private economy. You take another $1.4 billion out, which is what the PFD basically is. You take taxes out, and you're going to hurt the private economy that much more. It's not a zero-sum game. Dollars in the private economy are more meaningful to Alaska than dollars in the government economy. 3 key points. Alaska's facing a budget challenge, but it may not be as big as some suggest. There's a solid, reasonable, and realistic fiscal alternative that doesn't rely on PFD cuts or taxes. HB 311, circle it, talk to your representatives about it. And then, in my opinion, the Governor McGuire's and Hawker's bills are unnecessary and balanced, maybe more harm than good to the overall Alaska economy. If they pass a PFD bill, this session, you're going to see me back here. You're going to see me in other parts of the state talking about a referendum to repeal the bill and protect the PFD. That hashtag is going to become very popular. We can do a referendum, we can repeal it, and then send them back and have them do the work all over again. I don't want to do that. I like basketball, I like concerts, I want to travel a little bit this fall. I don't want to be talking about this, but if they pass a PFD bill, that's what I'll be talking about. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. What time is it?
35 past.
7:35. Great. Somebody tell me when it's 7:55. Anybody has questions for? Go ahead.
Mike?
Lisa McGuire did a presentation on SB 114 here again. A lot of it was over the top of my head. The one thing that did strike me was there was quite a conversation about the inflation proofing, and they had the commissioner for the PFD speak to it. So you made what I got out of it was we really don't need to be inflation proofing because we put in $1 billion. It was 700, 800 million. She said rounded off to $1 billion. We're putting $1 billion in inflation proofing. Actually, we're actually building up the corpus. So we don't really need. We could cut that $1 billion out.
Okay.
And then there's something about 25% of the oil. 25 was going someplace, and 75 was going to PFD, or the 25 was going to PFD. And I didn't understand.
So Liesl's bill, let me try to do this backwards. Liesl's bill is to change the way the permanent fund dividends calculated. Instead of calculating it off the earnings from the permanent fund itself, instead of paying Alaskans based upon the earnings of our investments, she flips that, takes all that money to government, and then pays the PFD off of oil revenues. That's the 75-25. She pays about 75% of oil royalties. So you tie the PFD, that's the reason that the PFD number keeps going down, or the percentage of cut keeps going up. You tie the PFD number to oil. You don't tie it to earnings from the permanent fund. Basically, it's a bait and switch. It's essentially saying, yeah, we build up this permanent fund, right? And we've been basing earnings or the dividend off the earnings of the permanent fund. Now that it's pretty good size, now that the earnings are pretty good size, yeah, we're going to get that to government. And we're going to start basing the PFD off of oil revenues, which are projected to be in somewhat decline over time. And that's what we're going to pay the dividend on. So it's a way of putting the dividend out of business, frankly, and giving government the money from the permanent fund dividend. The inflation proofing, I could probably spend 30 minutes explaining inflation proofing. Basically, Liesel's bill is okay just from an inflation proofing standpoint. It does inflation proofing right. We need to do it the way we're doing it with the permanent fund program we have right now, with the dividend program we're having right now. The way she switches it, and I can explain this again in 30 minutes. The way she switches it, it's okay that she's not doing inflation proofing. There's an implicit inflation proofing going on.
Okay, but follow them, it just, I do a little con on this. Because you were saying that the oil industry, the cost of oil goes down and up and down and up.
Mm-hmm.
If she does the way she's talking, yeah, if we're going to have less going into PFD, but then in 2-3 years the price of oil goes back up, wouldn't that offset that?
It could, but keep in mind that even under my scenario, I've got a production decline built in here, right? I've got a 3% production decline. So oil, even in my scenario, oil is in decline. There's a chance that we could have a bump. LNG is going to help that some for a while, but even in my scenario, I have an oil decline. So it's the glide path to when the PFD goes out of business.
Marvin?
Just thinking about new oil and productions and keeping the production up. You think of Shell and all the regulations that cause that to go down. If we don't get the right administration and regulations get tougher, then what happens?
Yep. So the new 120,000 barrel a day prospect we've got out there, the Army Corps of Engineers just put it into an EIS process, a full-blown EIS process. And that's going to be, we're going to have to deal with that. I mean, part of it was they didn't do their relationships right. The village in New Mixon's upset about how they want to develop it, too much sand or too much gravel or something. And they spilled it over into an EIS process. We need to work through that EIS process quickly. If we don't, then the prospects of that additional 120,000 start fading away. That is a problem. The more regulations we have, and the more burdensome it is to produce up here, the more likely producers are to take their money someplace else. But they did spend enough money to find that 120,000 barrels. And you just don't turn your back on a 120,000 barrel field. So if we can get through that process, it can be added. But that's a very good point.
Ken Mosher?
Okay, the state goes off of the figure that the oil revenue is going to be per barrel price. Why does it take them a month to raise it, but it takes them 3 or 4 years to lower that price? I mean, they just went off the $100 barrel.
Yeah.
This year.
So
last year.
So the way the state predicts oil prices is sort of a mystery, right? On a day in October, they bring in a bunch of experts on 2 days, to be fair. They bring in a bunch of experts. They all sit around in a room and they sort of commune about what the oil price is going to be, right? And they're heavily swayed by what's going on in the market right then. I mean, if oil's at $40, a lot of them say, oh, it's going to be $40 forever, right? It's going to stay in that level. That's always been problematic to me because it always resulted in high oil prices during upswings. It's now resulting in very low prices during low oil swings. To me, I just go out and look for a really good model and adopt that model. I mean, the IEA model there's been a lot of money invested in it. It's a very sophisticated model.
Even if you stayed low, that's just to your advantage.
Well, it's to your advantage except when Except when you tell yourself then you have a huge deficit because prices are going to stay low forever.
Yeah, it can't be like this, you gotta go.
Yeah, and they're not. I mean, you can see that. You can see that line.
Gretchen?
I like your optimistic thing about the LNG. Why am I getting the impression from the media or other people, you were saying the big three are still very investor interested in it, so I got the impression that they were all like this toward it.
No, they're still putting money into it. We're still in pre-feed. They're still investing in it. Frankly, there's a problem in the way the governor's approaching LNG. The governor's trying to drive LNG, to be very honest, back to the mindset he's always had about a government-owned project. Since the time of the Port Authority, and Fairbanks and North Star, and Fairbanks, North Slope, and Valdez were in that project, and the governor was the head of it. He's always had this mindset about he wants to drive it to a government-owned process for reasons that frankly go back to Wally Hickel. So we've gotten into a situation where the governor's trying to drive it one way, the investors are trying to hang on and trying to keep going, trying to keep pushing it because they see it as a very good prospect. The governor may ultimately kill it in the things that he's doing. But these investors are continuing to invest in it. They view this as a big project. It's well placed strategically to the far east, which is where the growing markets are. We already know where the gas is. We don't have to go invest in finding it. We already have the infrastructure in place to produce the gas because we've had the wells there to produce the oil, and the gas is coming up along with it. The risk factor and the upstream cost factor are very low with this project compared to other projects in the world. It's a very good project, very good project. They want to stay with it. The governor's trying to drive it in a direction that makes it more difficult.
George?
So did Repsol do anything with the field this year?
Repsol is having a little bit of global difficulty. Alaska was sort of a marginal play for them. They've turned it back over to Armstrong, which frankly is the one who originally found the field. Armstrong's out looking for financial partners to come back into the field. They didn't do drilling this year, but Mark Myers, who I trust as a geologist, Mark's looked at the data, says, yeah, it looks like there's a field there. I suspect Armstrong will be able to find the financing to go forward.
Somebody else?
Yeah. Back there.
Bill?
Brad, were you saying that the governor's insistence on state ownership of a large portion of that project is what's hurt us?
Yep, it's part of the problem. I mean, so look at it from the standpoint of the owners, right? They're gonna have this big gas field. They're gonna make a huge investment in, and the pipeline is a necessary piece. The liquefaction plant is a necessary piece of monetizing it. They don't want to turn it over to government because government spends a hell of a lot. Government screws it up usually, and government doesn't engineer things as well as oil companies do when you come to an oil project. They don't want to turn it over to the government. They want to stay in as partners, and they want the state as a partner because the state owns a portion of the upstream. But the governor's insistence on driving it, on doing things that drive it more and more to government ownership, make them very concerned. So when Gretchen says, yeah, they're looking, they look a little pale sometimes, that's why. They're trying to figure out if they can keep this project alive, keep it on track, as it's been designed as a four-party partnership.
And is the governor's plan require the purpose of the permanent fund to get there?
Yeah, so the governor's been very sketchy about where the funding comes from. Some people say that he's going to use the permanent fund. I don't think he has to, but to be very honest, if this ends up as a government-owned project, if he's successful in that, there won't be a project. Because the producers are not going to commit to a project. They're not going to commit to spending what it takes to get the gas going to a project that's owned by the government. It just won't happen.
So how does he get his half of the pipeline, or 40% or whatever he's looking for, without the purpose of the permanent fund?
So it's only, well, A, the project's not going to happen, so I don't really worry about that much. B, it'd be debt financing. It'd be revenue bonds based upon the revenue that would be produced from the project. That's what he would assume.
And those bonds,
You're
of course,
done.
are sensitive to our Moody's and S&P.
Yeah, they're sensitive to interest rates, exactly right.
You gotta give Ken a chance. Yes. Oh, wait, Ken, now, wait, quick, okay.
Okay, Godstein had a
Yeah,
non-pipeline.
yeah.
How in the world, without icebreakers, are you gonna get gas out of Prudhoe without
Yeah, so David's always got this idea of how he's gonna do this stuff. Basically, he wants to take a pipeline over to Nome, build a big port at Nome, build the port at Nome, and icebreaker it out of Nome.
Whose
We don't
idea
have
of
any
that?
icebreakers.
No, we don't, but and Nome isn't a proven port, and I mean, there's also.
The other thing with LNGs, doesn't that still come under the